Tesla's Attic, Chapters 13 and 14. Chapter 13, Mark of the Accelerati. Nick leaned back from his computer and held the gold pin up to the light streaming through the attic skylight. The tiny A sparkled. He had spent half the afternoon searching online for anything resembling it, and he had come up blank. He even scanned the face of the pin and tried a Google match. Nada. The A had to stand for something, and the infinity symbol was probably significant too, but without any clues, it was all just guesswork. "I'm not surprised you didn't find anything," Caitlin said when he called her, which may or may not have implied that she thought he was inept. Nick couldn't say for sure, but he wasn't about to use the reel-to-reel to find out. That would be far too sneaky. "All right," said Caitlin, "then we'll go with Plan B." "I didn't know there was a Plan B." "There's always a Plan B." She explained that there was a jeweler in town who was the expert in personal adornment. "I really don't feel comfortable showing the pin to anyone else," Nick told her. "Don't worry," Caitlin assured him. "He's a family friend. We've been going to him for years. He's the model of discretion." "Whatever that means," said Nick. "It means we can trust him. Anyway, I already set up an appointment. He doesn't usually work late on Sundays, but I think he has a crush on my mother, and he keeps hoping she'll come in one day to have her wedding ring appraised. So he made a special exception. We have a meeting with him at 7:30 tonight." Caitlin liked to believe she lived for adventure, but any adventure in her life had been limited to drama she created herself. Here, however, was something real, or surreal, as it were. Here was an event that was larger than life and, relatively speaking, in her own backyard. Now she had a real mystery that involved shady, well-dressed people, a secret symbol, and a boy who was both smart and cute. Caitlin suspected he might even evolve from cute into seriously good-looking when the rest of his face caught up with his ears, and he did something about his perpetual hat hair. She was resigned to the fact that there would be no such evolution for Theo. Yes, he had the good looks part down, if you didn't mind the extra vertebrae in his neck. But as for smarts, well, he was eternally mired smack in the middle of the bell curve. He wasn't stupid, just woefully average, which might have been fine if he wasn't always so pleased with himself. Perhaps the between-the-lines conversation played over the school's loudspeaker was a blessing in disguise. Nick showed up on foot at 7. "Don't you have a bike?" "Lost it in the fire." "Right, sorry. You can borrow my dad's." And although it was a bit big for him, he handled it well. They rode side by side, hogging the bike lane, as they made their way to Swedberg and Sons Fine Jewelers. "So how are Danny and your father dealing with what happened?" "They're not," Nick told her. "Danny's the kind of kid who takes things as they come, and my dad, well, whenever there's something he can't understand, he gets weirdly busy with stuff he does understand. When I left, he was weed whacking." "At night?" "Exactly." They made their way into the business district where elegant, newly restored shops nestled beside original businesses that hadn't changed a window display in recorded history. There was a fabric store near that solid hideous remnants from the 70s, that sold hideous remnants from the 70s, and a shoe store that had a sun-faded poster for hush puppies, whatever those were. Even in daylight, those older stores could feel creepy, or at the very least depressing. But on a Sunday night, void of any foot traffic, those dark plate glass windows were bleakly foreboding. Caitlin coasted to a stop in front of Swedberg's jewelry store, with Nick right behind her. The shop was as dark as all the others. "Are you sure he's here?" Nick asked. Maybe he forgot. Caitlin got off her bike and tried the door, fully expecting it to be locked. But it opened when she pulled on it. A warm breath of air pulsed out from the inside. A bell above the door jingled uproariously loud in the silence, and Caitlin flinched. Nick snickered at that, and she gave him a dirty look. No doubt if he had been the one opening the door, he would have flinched too. She should have remembered the bell from her childhood. Although it had been many, many years since she'd been here, her father, always in a panic, used to take her to pick out the last-minute Valentine's Day gifts for her mother. And Caitlin would go again when her mother returned the gift and picked out something she actually liked. It was a secret known only to Caitlin, her mother, and Mr. Swedberg, so she felt an odd sort of camaraderie with the man, co-conspirators in a secret intrigue of jewels. "Come, come," said a voice from the back. "Is that you, Miss Westfield? Come, come." There was a faint light from the rear of the shop, creating long, tiny shadows of rings, necklaces, and bracelets in the jewelry cases. There was not enough light to make them sparkle, though. There, in the very back, as always, sat a tired, 50-ish man. In his little workspace, he looked exactly the same as he always had to Caitlin, maybe only a little dustier. His eyes were a bit too small for his face, which he tried to compensate for by opening them wide whenever he spoke. It gave the impression that he was always astonished to find himself in a conversation. "Hello, Mr. Swedberg. I can't thank you enough for taking the time to meet us like this." He looked up and smiled with more warmth, it seemed, than the place allowed. "This can't be right," he said. "Last I recall, young Miss Westfield was just so high, clinging to her mommy's pant leg with ice cream sticky fingers," and he winked. He always winked at her. Further proof of their jewelry conspiracy. The wink made her look away awkwardly, as it had all those years ago. "How's your mother?" "She's good," Caitlin said, making a mental note that he didn't ask about her father. Then Swedberg turned to Nick. "And this must be the young man you told me about." "Nick Slate, a friend." Nick offered his hand to shake. "Well, Nick Slate, a friend. It's very chivalrous of you to escort a young lady on a dark night." "Not so dark," said Caitlin, already tired of the small talk. She and Nick sat down on stools beside the workstation, with Nick sitting beside her. She imagined they looked like a nervous young couple about to choose an engagement ring, which made her irritated at Nick, even though it wasn't his fault. The old jeweler looked silently back and forth between them. Caitlin began to worry that there was some protocol to such private transactions, and she was blowing it. "So," she said. "So," Swedberg answered, "you mentioned some jewelry. You wanted appraised, yes?" Nick reached into his pocket. "It's a pin. I have it right here." He had it wrapped in a tissue, and Caitlin rolled her eyes. "You don't bring a jeweler something precious wrapped in a tissue." He should have at least located a velvet pouch somewhere. Surely his mother's jewelry collection would have one. Then all at once she remembered that Nick had lost his mother. She wanted to apologize, even though she hadn't actually said anything. Nick held the pin, but didn't extend it towards Swedberg yet. He looked to Caitlin. "You sure about this?" Caitlin turned to Swedberg. "My friend needs reassurance that this consultation will remain strictly confidential," she said. "Of course," said the jeweler. Now he seemed almost greedy to see what Nick held. Nick unwrapped the pin and placed it on the felt workstation, where it glistened under Swedberg's lamp. If Caitlin had expected any kind of reaction from Mr. Swedberg, she was disappointed. He simply picked up the pin and looked at it through an enormous magnifying lens. The jeweler said thoughtfully, touching the pin lightly with his fingertips. "Most likely gold, very fine quality. I'd guess 24 karat. The workmanship on the pin, too, is very fine. The insignia molded, not stamped." He sighed and felt the pin in his palm. "But it's very light, I'm afraid, so even if the gold is pure, it would not be worth very much." "Do you recognize the symbol on it?" Caitlin asked. "Maybe it has more value as an object art than its weight would suggest." As the jeweler studied the front of the pin, Nick mouthed the words "object art" at her. Caitlin studiously ignored him. "It's a V letter form with traditional stems," the jeweler muttered, "bisected by a figure 8. There's something familiar about it." "Turn it over," Nick prompted. "It's an A, not a V. And isn't a sideways figure 8 the infinity symbol?" Swedberg turned the pin right side up, and the moment he did, his eyes, already wide, peeled a bit farther, and he suddenly stopped talking. Caitlin imagined that all the watches in the glass cases stopped as well. What is it? Nick asked. A brief hesitation, then Svedberg shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Indigestion. My doctor says I should stay away from spicy foods, but I do love the occasional jalapeno. Then he stood and handed Nick back the pin. I wish I could be of more help. Best of luck to you, though. But wait, Nick said, and he looked to Caitlin, as if the jeweler's sudden shift in demeanor was her fault. Then back to Svedberg. You said it seemed familiar. I was mistaken, Svedberg said quickly. One sees so many designs in this business. One symbol is bound to be confused with another. But Caitlin could sense unspoken volumes. The question was how to extract whatever information Svedberg was hiding. When the answer came, it was far easier than she imagined, and far too devious for comfort. But this was one case where Caitlin concluded that the end justified the means. My mother will be so disappointed, she said. At that, Svedberg perked up. Don't tell me this is your mother's. Well, it was a gift. From whom? That's the thing. She's not entirely sure. It arrived anonymously. Then Svedberg looked suspiciously at Nick. So, if it's your mother's, why did he have it? Are you kidding me? Said Nick, not even missing a beat. Look how tight her jeans are. You can't get anything in those pockets. That's right, said Caitlin, smiling through the sting. So I asked Nick to hold it, considering his clothes are so ill-fitting. She smiled sweetly at Mr. Svedberg. It would mean a lot to my mother if she knew just what it was. Then maybe we could figure out who sent it. Svedberg looked at the two of them, and Caitlin could sense his resolve to stay silent began to crumble. Just one more nudge. She always speaks of you so fondly. That's why I came to you, because I thought you'd be kind enough to help her. That did it. Svedberg put his hand on the glass jewelry case as if to keep himself steady. I don't suppose you've heard of, his voice dropped to a whisper, the Accelerati. Caitlin looked at Nick, who only shrugged. Suffice to say that whoever sent this to your mother is not to be trifled with. Bring her here tomorrow night and I'll tell her what I know. Bring her here? Yes, tomorrow. Am I being unclear? Caitlin's head was already reeling at the thought of having to involve her mother in this, but Nick rose to fill the void. Thank you, Mr. Svedberg, he said, shaking the man's hand. I'm sure Mrs. Westfield will be grateful for your help. And they left, the jingling bells announcing their exit to anyone who might be nearby. History is filled with a sordid assortment of secret societies, each dedicated to either the betterment or the destruction of humanity. Regardless of their aim, however, all secret societies have one thing in common. They all have a stupid pin, or a stupid hat, or a ridiculously stupid handshake. When it came to secret societies, the Accelerati were at the pinnacle of the pyramid. Their interest in Nick Slate was no small thing, and if Nick knew what grand events now revolved around him, he might have run to the farthest side of the globe. But in this instance, ignorance was his greatest asset. Nick hurried up to his room the second he got home, and he tried to do a web search of Accelerati. But the moment he hit the enter, his computer crashed. He rebooted, tried again on a different search engine, and his computer crashed again and again. He wondered if Caitlin had a similar problem, but he didn't want to call her because she was miffed by his comment about her jeans. I had to come up with something, Nick had told her, and it worked, didn't it? Nevertheless, any affront to Caitlin's fashion sense, no matter the motivation, destined him for the doghouse, at least until morning. It was maddening because Nick had no one else he could discuss this with. He couldn't talk to Mitch about it. Mitch already had enough on his mind after the fateful visit to his father, and although Vince was aware that something was up, he didn't exactly engender a warm feeling of trust. There was always Petula, but hadn't Nick suffered enough already? On Monday morning, as Nick was leaving for school, Vince showed up at his door with a baseball bat. For you, he said. Very funny. Nick figured he had heard it from Caitlin, or maybe Mitch, about Danny's involvement in the falling star incident. I don't do funny, Vince said. This came from your garage sale. Nick hadn't even remembered it. How did you find it? There is a dark underworld of mailbox smashers, Vince told him, and baseball bats suffer high casualties in the enterprise. The smashers are always looking for cheap ones. Once I remembered that there was a bat in your garage sale, I knew exactly where to look for it. Nick took it from Vince gingerly, as if it were made of glass. It doesn't look damaged. Smashing only happens on alternate Tuesdays, so we were lucky, Vince said. You owe me $15. Nick was more than happy to pay up. He returned the object to the corner of his attic, satisfied that for once all was well. At school, however, all was not well with Mitch. Nick noticed that he was uncharacteristically silent in class. And during lunch, he didn't finish anyone's sentences, nor did he have loud conversations or inject himself into anyone else's business. He just sat, ate, cleaned up after himself, and quietly observed the world around him. When Nick had finished his own lunch, he went over to Mitch. Hey, he offered tentatively. Hey, so you left it at home? They both knew what Nick was referring to. It's not like I need the thing to survive. Then Mitch added, I don't even miss it. Although Nick could tell that he did. It's good you don't have it, he told him. It proves you control it and not the other way around. That actually made Mitch smile. Yeah, that's true, isn't it? I mean, the thing is what it is, but I am what I am, with or without it. Then he got a little somber again. So, who am I again? Nick shrugged. A half Hispanic, half Irish kid with a French sounding last name. Right, said Mitch ruefully. Even my name doesn't know who I am. Nick hadn't intended to make Mitch feel worse. I'll tell you what, when we find Tesla's identity crisis can opener, you can be the first to use it. Nah, said Mitch with a reluctant grin. It'll probably open up a can of worms. But Nick knew the can of worms was already open, and those worms were rapidly evolving into cobras. After school, Nick invited Mitch to join the second excursion to Speedberg's. It thrilled Nick that Caitlin balked slightly at the idea of Mitch coming along. It meant that she preferred quality time with Nick alone, but he felt that Mitch deserved and needed to be included. So let me get this straight, Mitch said as they sat on a bus headed downtown. You found a pin that belongs to a secret society, and some jeweler who's in love with Caitlin's mom is going to tell you all about it. Well, said Caitlin, he agreed to tell my mother. And your father feels about this how? Mitch asked. Caitlin hesitated. Well, he doesn't know. So you set your mom up on a date with some dude behind your dad's back? You're missing the point, Mitch, Nick told him. Her mom's not going to be there. Mitch was quiet for a moment and then asked, Does she know that? Nick gave up. Mitch was grinding more gears than their bus as he tried to get up to speed. However, he had actually brought up a good point. Whether he realized it or not, Speedberg did think this was a date of sorts. Nick turned to Caitlin. What if he refuses to tell us anything when your mom doesn't show? You worry too much, Caitlin replied curtly. I'll sweet talk him. Watch and learn. When they got off the bus, one corner from the shop, Nick's anticipation began to spike. Was it too much to hope that Sweetberg's explanation would encompass not only the Accelerati, but the items in his attic as well? Here we are, Caitlin said as they approached the shop. It was Nick who first realized that something was very wrong when he saw a disturbingly familiar green and black sign above the entrance. He touched Caitlin's arm to get her attention. She looked at him, noted the sheer disbelief in his eyes, and then she looked at the shop. What had been Sweetberg and Sons fine jewelers yesterday was now a Starbucks. So, said Mitch, are we getting frappuccinos first? This can't be right, said Caitlin, the pitch of her voice rising slightly. It was right here between the bank and the barber shop, remember? Yeah, I do. If Nick hadn't seen it for himself, he would have thought she lost her mind. You guys must be wrong, said Mitch. I mean, Starbucks don't just pop up overnight out of nowhere, do they? Nick pushed his way into the store, followed by Caitlin and then Mitch, who was already getting his wallet out for purchase. The smell of freshly brewed coffee hit Nick instead of the musty odor of the old jewelry store. The display cases on the right had been replaced by people with drinks and laptops, and the counter to the left was now a barista station. Nick went straight to the cashier, not caring that he had cut in front of half a dozen people in line. "Who are you and what's going on here?" Nick demanded of the teenage clerk, a girl just a few years older than him. "And don't you dare tell me you've no idea what I'm talking about." To which the clerk replied, "I have no idea what you're talking about. Swedenborg's jewelry store was here exactly," he looked at his watch, "20 hours ago." "Don't know anything about it," the clerk shrugged. "I work on the 4th Street store, but they told me to come here today." Caitlin, who had been quizzing the barista at the other end of the counter, shook her head toward Nick as if to say, "These clowns know nothing." "Who's in charge here?" Nick asked the cashier. "That would be me. Now, if you'll excuse me, there are people waiting to order." Then she turned to the woman standing behind Nick. Nick took a step back and let the clueless cashier wait on the equally clueless customers. When Caitlin came to him, she was trembling at this new caffeinated reality. "So, can I buy you a drink?" Nick asked. "Cappuccino," she said. "Make it a double." "Guys?" They both turned to see Mitch, looking about as troubled as they were. "I thought you were both yanking my crank until I found this in the corner." And he held up a diamond ring. In the end, they chose to forget the drinks in favor of getting out of there. They spent the rest of the afternoon at Beefarama, and although they ordered, their basket of fries was ignored. Caitlin was still visibly shaken, avoiding eye contact. "Listen, there's Nick began. Caitlin pounded her fist on the table, dislodging a flurry of fries. "If you say logical explanation, I'll slap you so hard they'll find your eyes in Denver." Nick shifted his baseball cap, a little nervous and a little impressed. "Guys," said Mitch, still holding the ring, "I think this diamond is real. Check it out." He reached over and used the diamond to make a scratch on the window, large enough to be cause for a lawsuit if the owner had seen. "How much do you think it's worth?" Caitlin snatched it from him. "It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to Swedenborg, and when we find him, we give it back. Got it?" Nick took a deep breath, feeling it was his duty to state the obvious. "He's been disappeared. We have to accept it." Caitlin folded her arms and looked out the window rather than at Nick. "I accept nothing." "Disappeared by who?" asked Mitch. But Nick knew it was best not to involve Mitch any deeper than he already was. "You don't want to know." Maybe it was Nick's tone of voice or the look on his face, but Mitch's curiosity was shut down as effectively as Swedenborg's jewelry shop. He cast his eyes to the cold, limp, and lonely fries. What a waste. But still, he didn't eat. Caitlin stood up abruptly. "I'm done. I'm going back to my art projects and my school projects and my cheerleading projects." "And your Theo projects?" asked Nick, regretting it immediately. Caitlin pursed her lips. "At least I know he won't be a coffee house tomorrow." "No," said Mitch, "but he might be a percolator." Caitlin gave him a flesh-incinerating glare. "That's not even funny." Then she turned and stormed toward the restroom. Nick went after her, and he paced the restroom hallway, not sure what to say to her when she came out. How could he talk her down when he was on the same ledge beside her? Caitlin came out a moment later, but she wasn't angry anymore. She was in tears. She looked up to see him there. He thought she might try to hide her face, but she didn't. "Abnormal things don't happen to me," she told Nick through her tears. "I happen to them." And although Nick had no idea what that meant, he knew exactly how she felt, and he found himself putting his arms around her. "It's not the end of the world," he told her. "I know," she said. "It's just—" But she never finished her thought because Mitch had arrived, and he was putting his arms around both of them. "Good idea," said Mitch. "Group hug." And they stood there like that until somebody needed to get past them to use the restroom. Nick went straight up to his room when he arrived home. He pulled the attic trapdoor closed behind him and slipped beneath his covers, determined to escape into unconsciousness. For 10 minutes he tossed and turned, unable to get warm, and too wired on his own adrenaline to find relief. He couldn't tell how much of his exhaustion was physical and how much was emotional. He wished there was a device from his attic that could make him forget any of this happened. But if a blissful ignorance machine had ever been in his attic, it had been sold for a bargain at his garage sale. He sat up, thinking he might try getting on his computer to Uber Google Tesla again and find out things even Petula didn't know. It was then that he noticed his dirty clothes were gathered in the center of his attic once more, and his bed and desk had moved away from the walls again. And not only that, but the original attic items that he had retrieved seemed to be frozen in mid-migration toward the center of the room. He reached beneath his mattress and pulled out the baseball mitt just to make sure it was where he left it. Then he stood up and approached the center of the room. He could no longer deny that there was some sort of gravity pulling things to the center of his attic. He could feel heat emanating from the spot. It was directly beneath the skylight, so perhaps it had been warmed by the sun, but it shouldn't still be warm now that it was twilight. Nick lay down on his back amid the laundry, using the baseball glove as a pillow, and soaked in the warmth. It was more than just warmth, however. As he lay there, he had an undeniable sense of connection. That was the only way he could describe it. He thought about all the items that had been in his attic. He had no idea where they were or how they were being used, yet somehow he felt them out there just as clearly as he could feel his fingers and toes. They were part of him, or more accurately, he was part of them. It was a deeply satisfying sensation, so satisfying that his whole body relaxed and he drifted off into contented sleep. Danny shook him awake. You were hiding up here all along. I knew it. Nick took a moment to gather his wits. He was still beneath the skylight, only now the twilight sky had given way to night. I wasn't hiding, Nick told his brother. I just took a nap. Dad thinks you didn't come home, that you stayed away on purpose. There was a sadness to Danny's voice that didn't seem right. What are you doing with my glove? I thought they took it. Yes, said Nick. They thought they took it too. He was worried that Danny might make a big deal out of it, but he didn't. Again, that seemed odd. You missed dinner, Danny told him. Dad cooked roast, but it burned, so he called it Cajun blackened beef. Nick could not recall a single instance when his father had used a kitchen appliance. Why? What's the occasion? Danny just stared at him. Then he started to get red in the face. Nothing, he said. I guess it doesn't matter. Then he left. A few moments later, Nick heard him slam his bedroom door, one floor below. When it hit Nick, it hit him like with such a wave of misery and regret. He almost doubled over in pain. But the pain wasn't just in his gut, it was everywhere. Today was his mother's birthday. It wasn't like they spoke of it. Nick's father certainly hadn't mentioned it, and the weight of her absence was such a constant. Their day-to-day lives gave no hint that a dark milestone was looming on the calendar. How could he have forgotten his mother's birthday? What kind of a person was he? He could almost see her shaking her head at him. Nicky, 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 where's your head? She was the only one that he allowed to call him Nicky. No one was allowed to call him that, and no one ever would be. He left his room practically falling down the attic ladder, which retreated back into the ceiling, its springs activated by his final bound. Down in the living room, his father had hooked up a video recorder to the TV. He was watching an old baseball game. Although the figures in the field were too far away for Nick to be able to see their faces, he could tell by the number on the pitcher's jersey and the way he moved that it was a younger version of his father. Mr. Slate took a quick look at him, and then his eyes went back to the TV. This was one game before I blew out my elbow. Almost a no-hitter. Nick watched his father throw a perfect pitch. It was 10 years ago, but it felt like it could have been 100. Dad, I'm sorry. Shh, his father said, and then he added, nothing to be sorry about. Nick sat beside him on the sofa. It was only a few minutes in when Nick realized why his dad was watching the video. His father had always been the one to man the camera, but this time he was on the field, which meant someone else was holding it. Nicky, stop squirming, he heard his mother say. The image jostled and went momentarily skyward before refocusing. He heard his younger self complaining about being thirsty and cold and wanting a hot dog. He must have been, what, 4? Danny hadn't even been born yet. Nicky, watch Daddy. I'm watching, but he's not watching me. That's because he's watching the batter. But he just looked away, because he's checking the runner. So he doesn't steal? That's right. And then his father struck out the batter. and the fielders came running into a thunderous applause. Nick knew there were plenty of videos of his mother, but he also knew why his father had chosen this one. If he saw her, if he watched her smile at the camera and do the casual, everyday thing a person does, it would be too much to bear. But hearing her, that was something he could handle. She would be happy you were out with friends today, Nick's father told him. She'd be glad to know you're getting along so well in a new. He choked up before he could finish. Nick could feel his own tears threatening to become volcanic, but he could not let it happen. When one of them cried, the other two remained strong. That's the way they kept one another afloat. So Nick leaned into his father, as he had when he was little. Can you start it over, Dad? He asked. I want to see the whole game. Sure thing, Nick. His father rewound the tape to the beginning, and together they listened to Nick's mother try to keep little Nicky content for the better part of 2 hours. It wasn't until the video had ended that they realized Danny had vanished from the house. Chapter 14. Makes no difference who you are. Nick's first thought was that Jorgensen had taken Danny, that he had figured out the glove was a fake and he'd come back for vengeance. But if that were the case, Nick would have heard something. Plus, Danny's jacket was gone, which meant he had left the house on his own. Where he had gone and why was anyone's guess. Your brother barely knows this town, his father raved. The man was already an emotional wreck tonight. He didn't need this. Where could he possibly go? It's good that he doesn't know the area. That means there aren't many places he knows to go, Nick told his father. They drove to his school and walked the perimeter looking for signs of Danny. They went to the ice cream shop they had already been to twice since moving in. It was just as Mr. Slate was getting ready to dial 911 that a bright flash in the sky caught their attention. Was that? But before Nick could finish the thought, something else streaked brightly down from the heavens, landing somewhere nearby. By the time the third one came, they were back in the car, speeding toward the sports complex. They arrived in time to see yet another shooting star rocket down and smack into Danny's glove, giving off a sound like a tiny sonic boom. He was thrown back and dragged through the dirt, leaving a trench just like the first time. Only this time there were multiple trenches around him. Danny! Called their father, sprinting across the field toward him. Danny was already up again, raising his mitt, assuming a ready position. Go away, he yelled, keeping his eyes fixed on the sky. I gotta do this. I gotta do this. Before their father could get to him, another meteorite came plunging out of nowhere, drawn toward Danny's glove. Dad! Yelled Nick. His father turned just in time to see it and dive out of the way. A flaming meteorite dragged Danny even farther than before, and yet, in an instant, Danny dropped the smoking wad of iron to the ground and got up again. For the love of God, what's going on? Their dad yelled. Nick reached Danny before he could put the mitt up once more. But Danny struggled against him as if his life depended on it, catching just one more flaming flyball. There's got to be something to it, Nick, Danny said desperately. There's got to be. What are you talking about? Danny's eyes, wide and pleading, glistened with tears. Wishing on falling stars. They're falling for a reason, and I know why. Biting Nick, he thrust his gloved hand into the air again. To make the wish come true. To bring Mom back. Suddenly the night sky looked brighter than daytime. When Nick turned, he saw a huge fireball, roughly the size of a washing machine, hurtling towards them. Nick ripped the glove from his brother's hand, hurled it into the air, and threw himself and his brother into one of the ditches to get out of the way. With the roar of a bullet train bearing down on them, the huge meteorite hit the glove and just kept on going, shaking the earth around them. When the thunder subsided and Nick looked up, he saw a trench at least 10 feet deep. It had torn a huge hole in the right field fence and had taken down several trees. He could see the angry piece of sky lying at the dark end of the ditch, white hot, slowly smoldering to red as it cooled. The glove had somehow protected his brother from the other meteorites, but he doubted it would have saved him from this one. And there, lying in the ditch with him, his eyes closed tightly, Danny muttered, I wish she was back. I wish she was back, pleading with the field full of shooting stars to grant him his heart's desire. And then his words faded into gentle sobs. It's all right, Danny. It's going to be all right. Nick turned to see their father coming up to them, his eyes filled with a kind of numb disbelief, but it didn't stop him from reaching down, grabbing Danny in his strong arms, and carrying him off the field with Nick close behind. Danny fell asleep before they could reach the car, going limp in his father's arms, and Nick and his father were silent on the way home, for what was there to be said? His father knew that the questions he would ask Nick couldn't be answered. It was only after Danny was tucked in that Nick's father, leaning against the doorframe of Danny's room as if he needed it to hold him up, looked at Nick and said, "I think your brother's through with baseball." Nick thought he might say more, but instead he just gave Nick a hug, told him he had school tomorrow, and he went off to bed himself, apparently preferring the madness of dreams to the current madness of reality. Nick couldn't blame him, because he felt exactly the same way. Up in the attic, he pushed his bed back against the wall and lay down on it, choosing to avoid the center of the room. He twisted the accelerati pin in his fingers, knowing he was in over his head, but also knowing that there was nothing he could do about it. His one consolation was that a rain of meteorites had stopped before it could do any real damage. Of course, he didn't know that 43 million miles away, an asteroid roughly the size of Rhode Island had changed its trajectory by a single degree when Danny's glove was still held high in the air. A single degree, tiny in the grand scheme of things, but large enough to put it on collision course with the planet Earth.